Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fitness Pro Mentors podcast. This is Brandon, and I love helping personal trainers 2 to 3x their income. But today, this is way more important. If you want to be a successful personal trainer, you have to be rethinking everything exercise, challenging yourself so you can always provide the best product and service. And today, I have Mr. Charlie McMillin, who's someone I love and admire. Charlie, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing okay. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. I love your t-shirt.
Yeah.
Representing.
Oh, yeah. There's a back, too.
Oh, yeah. A new way of fitness. Absolutely love it. Hey, so Charlie, we got some exciting stuff to talk about today.
We do, I suppose.
Yeah.
Exciting for some. It might be entirely off the spectrum of boredom for others. But they can tune out if they want to, can't they?
Yeah, well, I know this has been a long time coming. You've been working and researching for many different reasons the history of manual muscle testing. And I have to say, I mean, one of the things I love that you do that's so amazing is you're consistently on Facebook and other platforms sharing as much information to people who are willing to listen as much as possible. You're giving away a bunch of research and just giving people the resources to do their own research. So I'm really excited because I think this is going to be an incredible resource people for a long time coming. So where do you think the best place to start would be?
Well, that's a good question. First, I'm going to start with getting the camera so that getting my screen so it kind of looks like I'm actually looking at the camera. Technology is wonderful unless you don't know how to use it like I don't. So I think the place to start is perhaps with the first, we talked about having a series of questions that you might think about of asking me. That might be the best way into this. Otherwise, I feel like a segue into a timeline is needed, and the questions do that well. So we might as well kind of go ahead, on that avenue if we want to.
So I would say the one thing that I have learned over the last little while from you, I know first I have learned a ton about manual muscle testing. You've exposed me to rethinking all these different forms of potentiation that potentially could be factors when you put your hands and push on someone. And there's one thing that I've seen the last little while that really blew my mind, which was that it was really the introduction of the exercise machine and the relationship of resistance machines and how they have a relationship to manual hands-on techniques that were used many years ago. To me, that seems like a great diving point, and I just love to know more about what you've explored with exercise machines, hands-on resistance, and how that happened.
Okay, so it's an interesting story because, as you know, I'm in the middle of a PhD dissertation, and my topic happens to relate to basically exercise dosage. I've got my title over here, which I can't say for sure whether it's not going to change or not, but the official title right now is Resistance Training Dose Selection and Management Methods for Patients with Persistent Symptoms of Lyme Disease. So this dissertation that I'm kind of in the throes of right now is a 3-article dissertation that obviously has to do with what the title speaks to what it is about. But one of the things that I'm looking at in terms of this dissertation is part of my research is looking at what you and I learned from Tom is the resistance profile, which in the literature is called a machine resistance curve sometimes it's called a machine torque curve, right? This is, depending upon whether you're talking about torque or force, this is the measured output graphically represented of what, let's just say we use a leg extension, what you might be able to measure with a dynamometer or a pressure sensor or something like that throughout the range of motion, chosen range of motion of a machine. So for a leg extension, for instance, some studies would look at maybe 6 points within a 120 degree range or 130 degree range. And they would measure the force at the input pad at those 6 even divisions of 120 degrees of range. And then they would map that out graphically. And obviously, we've talked about this before, in terms of a qualitative analysis, which is what we learned in the Resistance Training Specialist program, Tom Purvis's program. We learned how to kind of look at the various mechanical devices that are used to perhaps alter the moment arm at various axes in the machine. Well, a quantitative analysis is a more direct, not better, but just more direct measurement where you're actually taking measurements from the pad itself. So you're kind of getting the overall output through the series of linkages or cams or whatever might be used to change the resistance throughout the range. And so in the process of it's interesting, my mom, and I think I've talked about this before with you, because we've talked about the equipment modifications early on in one of these podcasts. My mom and I had another client would get on my plate-loaded Cybex machine, and she'd get about 40 degrees through the range, and it simply wasn't a large enough drop-off for her particular individual differences in terms of strength to be able to get through the range. This is with no load on it whatsoever. This is just the weight of the input arm and the metal itself, so to speak. And so I had to kind of modify something for her to be able to do this. Well, this is also true with another one of my clients, and it is also true when you're dealing with patients that have, call them significant issues, for lack of a better word, in terms of their ability to generate tension or force throughout a range of motion. And so when you're working with populations like I am, whether it be in research, currently I'm in a research study with the University of Maryland with their proton treatment center with cancer patients who are undergoing proton treatment. And when you're dealing with chronic disease populations and loading them, you want to make sure that you're not exceeding what their tolerance perhaps is. Because the goal, and we may all get to this point at some point during our lives, but the goal is sustainability. I actually heard a guy on ESPN talking the other night, and he had, I wish I could remember who it was now, but I do remember, but his name is slipping. And Richard Jefferson, I think, former NBA player, and he said, you know what the greatest ability of a professional athlete is? Availability. And I just thought, that's it, right? Like somebody who kind of gets it within the professional sports world, right? Because what you don't want you to ever do with somebody who's dealing with chronic disease or a professional athlete is to overdose their training. Anything that gets in the way of their ability to continue training or get out on the floor, if it's a basketball player, or the field, if it's an NFL player, that's a problem. And you certainly don't want to be the person responsible for that. Your goal is to try to, improve them through graduated resistance or whatever else. In any case, the idea that a machine was not necessarily accommodating my mom and another client and some of these chronic disease patients somewhat bothered me. I know that machine designs are different. I understand that a little bit of the history of it. I learned a lot, obviously, from Tom in terms of the history of these designs. But I don't think I knew exactly where the models, if you want to call it that, came from historically. Why did Cybex in this plate-loaded linkage style leg extension, why did they set up the machine in this way where there may be a drop-off in terms of the ascending curve, in terms of the machine torque curve, but it's not much, and it doesn't even occur until you put about 40 pounds of weight on the machine. Well, that eliminates a fair amount of people that may not be able to get the terminal extension with the type of force that they can get, generate in greater degrees of flexion of the knee. And so I started really kind of delving into the history. So I had taken a relatively massive break in terms of the investigations into manual muscle testing. I don't use manual muscle testing. I actually haven't used manual muscle testing since about 2012. And I'll talk about that when we get to the end of this in the last question. But I had taken a long break since 2018 when, we settled a lawsuit that we were involved in. And what I happened to experience when I was starting to look into the history of these resistance training machines was kind of crazy, because I basically got back to the middle of the 1800s, so the middle of the 19th century, and there were two big influences in terms of the development of resistance training machines. A guy named Gustav Zander and a guy named Charles Fayette Taylor. Now, both of these guys came up with, Taylor was interesting because he came up with what I can perceive to be, from the years spent looking into this, the first cam mechanism, the first eccentric cam mechanism, which was on a leg press. And he was using it with chronic disease patients. And so here I am, going through Taylor's work, and the same name keeps popping up, which is a guy named Peter Henry Ling. And then I'm looking at Zander's stuff, and Zander, who had these amazing pieces of equipment, mostly leverage, linkage style pieces of equipment, kind of like the earliest type of hammer strength stuff you could probably find. And Zander too was, this name kept popping up, of Peter Henry Ling. And so, and it really pertained to this idea called duplicated movements. So here you go. I'm looking back into the history of resistance training machines, trying to figure out who was the first person to really think about varying the force that would be experienced by the person on the machine. I end up in the middle of the 1800s with these two guys who keep talking about this thing called the Swedish movement cure. Peter Henry Ling's very famous foray into exercise therapy, so to speak. And Ling had a bunch of different components to this thing called the Swedish method. And one of them was something called duplicated movements. Now, there's a history here with Ling that I can get into a little bit later, but duplicated movements were manually applied resistance. That's what it was. And there were different forms of it. But basically, in this style of manual resistance application, what you would do is, let's just take a kind of a side lateral raise-ish thing, right? So you're doing a side lateral raise. What the person would do is they would apply, I keep forgetting it's flipped, the person would apply their force to the distal segment of your limb, and they would try to match your output, but just under what you could basically put out, so to speak. And so not enough to stop you ever, but just enough to keep going with you and provide resistance. And apparently, anybody that's done this knows how tiring this is as a trainer, but apparently they found that huge differences in terms of outcomes for their patients. And interestingly, what you hear for two different reasons was this development of machines came from, in Zander's case, it was a response to basically just the weariness and the fatigue that was induced by doing these things. When Gustav Zander would get with a patient or a client, and he would start pushing and pulling on them to create resistance that matched their output, what he would say is, this is great for one person, but I'd get to, 10 patients, and by the 10th patient a day, I completely lost my feel for it. And so I don't think I was giving good exercise, so to speak, when you do that. And so Zander's response to that is, how can I do this? How can I accommodate these patients in terms of resistance exercise, but not have to worry about the skill of the person doing it and whether they're skilled enough to actually match the resistance, and not have to worry about tiring myself out? Sounds to me like he was a bit of a micromanager, and just, he just didn't accept anybody else who really was capable of doing it the way he did, and he could only do like 3 of them before he would be exhausted. Taylor, similar to Zander, talked about how great duplicated movements were, but in Taylor's case, he was really looking for a way to objectively quantify progression. He wanted to be able to graduate the resistance and mark how well or regressive his patients were in terms of their strength. And so, in terms of progressive reporting or whatever, he wanted to make sure he had a method of doing that. And for him, pushing on somebody was not the greatest way to do that. The subjective experience of doing that wasn't for him objective enough, nor was it fine enough. And when I say fine, I'm talking about the difference between coarse and fine versus another type of fine. It wasn't specific or precise enough. And so that kind of got him to his machines. And so I thought, when I encountered this duplicated movement modality, I started thinking, wait a second. I mean, they're pushing on people. There's got to be some relationship to manual muscle testing with these things. And so here I am. I'd taken at least 2 years off of diving into the history of manual muscle testing. And I'm back at, I wonder whether these duplicated movements are really the source of manual muscle testing. Now, interestingly enough, because I was kind of so enthralled with some of these practitioners, whether it be Xander or Ling or Taylor, upon investigations of Taylor, he had this weird story with his brother. So Charles Taylor was the first person to introduce Ling's methods in the United States. And he had a brother named George Taylor. And George Taylor wrote a book. They both wrote books on the Swedish movement cure, introducing the methods of Ling into the United States. And at one point in time, they actually both went into business together in New York. And when you read Taylor writing a letter to his son, who ended up becoming a doctor as well. These all three of these guys were doctors. When he was writing a letter to his son, he talks about how he and George started this clinic, kind of an orthopedic clinic, and then he dissolved the partnership. And then you don't hear anything else about George. Now, George went over to Sweden, and George learned at one of the kind of schools that was underneath of the Ling method. Ling had already died at this point, but his stuff, so to speak, was taught at various schools. This was called the Orthopedic Institute in Stockholm. That's where George Taylor went. Charles Taylor went before, so there's this weird story about how George is in New York, and I think this is about 1858. And George is in New York, and he says to Charles Taylor, his brother, who's just graduated from the University of Vermont and gotten his medical degree, says, there's this guy here that has this really cool kind of exercise therapy that's really helping a lot of people. So George gets the bug and decides Charles gets the bug and decides that he's going to go to New York. So he goes to New York, and the guy isn't there anymore. I mean, it's just the weirdest story how these things are done. Now, remember, we're talking about stuff I'm reading that was written in the 1850s or 1860s. And so Charles is searching around for anybody that knows anything about this guy and finds another person who is familiar with this Swedish movement cure because he has a pamphlet that's written on it. And so he goes and finds this guy in New York City, finds this pamphlet, and it really doesn't say anything, but it mentions this guy named Georgie, who was one of the two people that Ling kind of accepted as being students of his that could instruct his methods. And so Georgie now lives in London. So Charles Taylor, in like 1859, decides to get on a boat and goes to London and meets up with this guy, Augustus Georgie, and Georgie's not really all that interested in helping out Charles Taylor, but sends him off to this guy named Matthias Roth. And Matthias Roth, who apparently doesn't speak very good English, he's a German guy, he effectively imparts what he can of the Swedish movement cure to Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor comes back. At this point, his brother George is over in Sweden at this orthopedic institute learning the Swedish movement cure. So there was probably some sort of conflict. They both wrote books on the Swedish movement cure, but here's the interesting part. Charles Taylor, I keep getting mixed up. Charles Taylor in, I want to say it is, I'm going to pull up my little timeline here. Charles Taylor in 1867, writes a book titled Infantile Paralysis and its Attendant Deformities. And here I am. Here's a guy that's written a book on the Swedish movement cure, and he talks specifically about the benefits of duplicated movements. He then designs these machines because he's trying to get quantifiable resistance profile, resistance curves he can mark progression with and all this stuff. And now he's writing a book about infantile paralysis. Now, anybody that's followed my Facebook posts or followed any of this history recognize, okay, there's a significance here that the guy that brought the Swedish movement cure and these duplicated movements, this manual resistance where you're trying to match the resistance or the output of the patient, is now writing a book on polio. And I'm thinking, okay, this is not coincidental. And so I'm thinking this has to be, speculation on my part, but speculation was later confirmed. And it was later confirmed because there was a guy named Charles Mills who was a neurologist, right, who would be encountering polio patients. And he wrote, there were lectures that he gave that were transcribed. He was at Philly, he was an MD at Philadelphia Hospital, neurologist, and two of his lectures on polio were transcribed in 1885. Then in 1888, he delivers a lecture called The Treatment of Nervous and Mental Disease by Systematized Active Exercises, and this is to the Philadelphia County Medical Society. And in this lecture, he states explicitly, Mills mentions that duplicated movements, he says the following about it, quote, in duplicated active movements, both the operator and the individual treated take part, the first resisting while the second acts, or the reverse. Sometimes these movements are spoken of as semi-active, semi-passive, yada, yada. Okay, but it says, in the latter, so in the former, the physician or operator resists. So in other words, the person's doing it and then you're basically providing resistance just under effectively concentric, right? I mean, most of the time. In the second one, okay, then the actual, the operator, the patient is resisting the operator. So it's generally eccentric, okay? So I'm thinking, okay, well now this guy who's a neurologist, right, 1888, he's talking about these duplicated movements. Sounds to me like we're getting close. 1896, I come across this particular report called Motor Disturbances. This is Mills again. No definite paralysis of the upper or lower extremities determined. Her grip in both hands and power of resistance and movement in arms as tested by duplicated movements are good. And boom, there it is. That confirms that duplicated movements, this way of applying manual force to a limb as somebody moves through a range, and you're either fighting them or they're fighting you, whatever, duplicated movements are the beginning of manual muscle testing. And so that's written in 1896. How long was this guy doing it? Well, at least since 1888, since he wrote the other thing about the duplicated movements in 1888. So you can kind of see as we go through this how this foray in the exercise machines and these guys, Zander and Taylor, their introduction to me of these duplicated movements of Peter Henry Ling are the reason why I kind of ended up full circle back at the history of manual muscle testing and where it probably originated.
So on that note, because I think this is a really interesting segue, because over like nearly 100-year period of time, you have this duplicated movement reference where it seems to me, at least from my understanding so far, that it was really like an incredible, fantastic way for resistance exercise to be applied, where they could modify and really challenge someone through whatever range, be it they were going for. Then these machines are created. And then in your opinion, I mean, have you read anything at that point with at that last section there where the duplicated movements were now starting to be kind of more qualitative and more quantitative, more qualitative rather, where people are starting to look at as a form of assessment more so at that time? Was that the introduction to the polio stuff?
Well, so what you're seeing is Mills and Taylor were both obviously treating people with polio. And so they were using the duplicated movements, and clearly Mills was using duplicated movements as a way to measure strength, okay?
Got it.
So when you go back, whether it be Ling or Zander or both of the Taylors, there was this big push, and this is just before what some people would consider the beginning of the physical culture movement, But it really was the start of the physical culture movement, where they started kind of, you remember, the drugs weren't very good back then. And so ways to treat diseases were not as effective in terms of pharmaceuticals. They didn't have what we have now. They obviously didn't have antibiotics the way that we have them now. And so, this was a lot of different diseases. People were at their wits' end with them. There was nowhere else to turn besides these guys who were doing exercise therapy. We always kind of make a joke that exercise may not necessarily be the greatest cure for any one disease, but it's rare that it can't help almost every condition, depending upon the individual, obviously. And so clearly a lot of people were benefiting from participation. And when you go all the way back to Peter Ling, he actually had a form of gout, and he had rheumatism, and it was in 1804. Okay, this guy Peter Ling. So we're back at the Swedish movement cure. He was hired as a fencing instructor. He had become a fencing master, and he was hired as a fencing instructor and a gymnastics instructor at this Lund University. Or apologize to anybody that's Swedish that's listening to me. Lund University, and through practicing fencing and participation in gymnastics back then, exercise is gymnastics. Okay, in this context, he alleviated himself of these problems. So that's what started him on the path of figuring out, like, wait a second, people can really benefit from this stuff. And so he actually enrolled on all the coursework at Lund University for a medical degree. He never finished his medical degree. He didn't certify as a doctor. He didn't want to. But he then developed his system called the Swedish Movement Cure. And at the time, it had 4 components to it. It had a pedagogical movement, or component to it. It had a medical, which is called kinesiopathy, and you'll see that referred to a lot in Xander's work and Taylor's work. And mechanotherapeutics is another one that you'll hear a lot about. And kinesiopathy is where duplicated movements were kind of situated in. And then there was military and aesthetic. So there were these 4 components. So when I'm talking about manual muscle testing in terms of duplicated movements coming from there, I'm really talking about this medical side of it, this kinesiopathy thing. And so as we move forward through the 19th century, we get to the end of the 19th century. Polio is, I hate to use this term because I think it's wrong, and if there's an epi listening to this, excuse me, but it was episodic epidemiologically, right? Like there were outbreaks that were considered epidemics, but they were small, and they mostly affected young kids. And so what everybody will see is the term infantile paralysis, which is the same thing as poliomyelitis. It was called infantile paralysis because of the early epidemics were mainly afflicting kids. It's kind of a misnomer because a huge number of adults were also afflicted later on in epidemics that happened more past the first quarter of the 20th century. So now we've got these guys, Mills, a neurologist, Taylor, a doctor, I guess more of an orthopedist, I don't know. And they're writing books, and they're talking about duplicated movements. They're writing books on polio. And you've got now the entrance of this guy, Robert Lovett. Okay, and Robert Lovett was an orthopedist at Harvard. And Lovett, up until about I want to say, at least I know it, in 1905, Lovett was using electrical stim to try to determine the quality of muscles and their ability to contract and work. And the thing that Lovett did, there's actually a name for it. He was measuring the minimum amount of time required to elicit a muscle contraction when a voltage twice the amount necessary to elicit a contraction was used with a steady current. It's called chronaxie testing. Now the chronaxie, chronaxie. Now here's the thing about chronaxie testing. This was not going to be helpful anywhere outside of a clinic. I mean, how are you going to test people for, whether they have paralysis due to polio, if you've got to take this, electrical stimulator? And you can imagine the machines back then slightly different than what we've got now in terms of stim units and stuff like that. So, but in 1907, okay, so Robert Lovett had a clinic, okay, that was a private clinic. He was at Harvard, but he also had his own private clinic, and his assistant in practice was a woman named Wilhelmine Wright. And Wilhelmine Wright, to many people in this country, excuse me, to many people in the United States, you're in Canada obviously, is considered the first physical therapist. To many people, not to everybody. Some people actually, in having conversations with people, some people consider Ling the first physical therapist, and some people consider Xander the first physical therapist. So you've got kind of mixtures, but at least as far as, you know, as a lot of the kind of American physical therapists go, Wilhelmine Wright was really kind of at the forefront of everything. And she was Lovett's assistant. And Lovett had a gym, okay, because exercise, even at that point, was recognized as being tremendously valuable for people with polio. So Lovett basically asked Wilhelmine Wright to help him out with developing and developing the strength tests to try to identify where in people's body perhaps they have the most weaknesses, or the pattern of weaknesses, if you want to call it that. But the other part of this was it was used as a way to monitor progression. Were these exercises helping these people? And so, you know, her goal was twofold, to try to develop these tests to determine what muscles might be the most affected by polio, where in the cord they might have the affliction. The virus attacks the gray matter both in your in the brainstem and in the spinal cord, and you know, you could localize by identifying the muscles below the level where the virus was, because they may have some level of paralysis. And so that was the second reason for it. And the third reason was to monitor progression. So the pattern of weakness, where might the virus be situated and destroying the cell bodies of these motor neurons, and then can we monitor progression and see whether anybody's getting better, so to speak. And so the first tests were predominantly gravity-based to see whether somebody could move through a range of motion, but they also used manual resistance in certain cases. And the first kind of, there was in 1912, pretty notable, I think. Wilhelmine Wright actually had an article published, and it was titled "Muscle Training in the Treatment of Infantile Paralysis," and she presents a method of grading exercises with and without manual resistance. And here are the grades, okay? There were 5 grades at that point. Muscles capable of overcoming gravity and an outside force is normal, okay? That was the best you could get. Muscle capable of overcoming gravity alone is good. Capable of overcoming friction of joint and table, fair. Take that for what it is right now. Muscle capable of overcoming friction only when assisted, poor. And muscle incapable of any contraction, bad. Okay, so that was the last. They got rid of the term bad later on. But they didn't like that very much. But anyway, it was a way, and she goes on to say, this furnishes a simple means of recording and noting progress. Thus, if the knee can be extended while the patient lies on his side, the quadriceps belongs to class 3. If later it can be extended when the patient sits on the table with his legs hanging down, it belongs to class 2, etc. And so this is where that kind of, that those levels, and they weren't really quantified at first. There was adjectives, those adjectives, normal, good, fair, poor, bad, were used to describe them. And that was really kind of the first grading system. So as far as I can tell, Lovett and Wright came up with the first grading system for manual muscle testing.
This grading system, now from our previous conversations, they had nothing like this before. I mean, if I recall, this was more of a, they had so many people that were ill at this time, struggling with paralysis, that it was very much that they needed to kind of do as much as they possibly could. And so this grading scale kind of helped them streamline the process somewhat to figure out where someone was on the medical treatment process of polio. Is that correct?
Kind of. So there was a big outbreak in Vermont in 1914. Well, started in 1910, but it was occurring, and Lovett was hired as the director of the treatment of patients in this kind of, they called it the Vermont series, because they studied basically what was happening to these people in Vermont in this huge outbreak. And Lovett, effectively, he did not like the subjective rating of manual muscle testing provided. And what he says is the range, because he classified things as paralyzed, partly paralyzed, and basically normal. And because if we look back at what Wright was saying here, most of these, okay, if it's overcoming gravity alone, good, that's probably partly paralyzed, because if all you can do is raise, if you can't handle any type of external force, then you got a problem. So you've got this massive range of partly paralyzed. Then you have totally paralyzed. That's obvious. And then you have normal. Well, that's obvious too, because if I push on you, you can respond to it in any way. You don't have partial paralysis. This range of partial paralysis was so big that it really wasn't. Remember, we talked about fine and coarse. It wasn't a fine enough measurement to be able to really determine any kind of improvement or regression or anything else. It was just, it was too hard with your hands to tell where within this massive range of partial paralysis they were, the patient. Okay, and so in 1915, he got together with a physiologist from Harvard named, I think his first name was Ernest Martin. And Ernest Martin and Robert Lovett said, this subjective way of grading muscle strength is not really suiting us very well. We need something more objective. And so they started basically creating these spring balance muscle tests, where it's just a handheld dynamometer. That's all they were using. It required a specially made table that basically you could peg the person down, and you would, in this case, they were called yield tests, which is where the beginnings of brake testing comes from. Because what they would do is they would hook the fishing scale, dynamometer, whatever you want to call it, the spring balance, through a sling up to the person's limb. And then and you've probably seen the pictures that I've posted of this before, there'd be like 4 different attendants sitting around helping to brace the person and everything else. But then they'd pull on the person, and when they broke, they would see what that level was, and they could now use that for progressive purposes. It was an objective number that they could use. Now, the table was important partially because they could make sure that when they measured these people over time, they put them in the exact same place every time. So they could check and see and make sure that they were getting an apples-to-apples type of comparison to track this. Here's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That last section right there where you're talking about the unique table apparatus and then their interpretation of their version of a dynamometer. I'm sorry, I want to clarify. Was that part also in the same polio world, or were they using that for other purposes?
That was all polio.
All polio. Okay, got it.
That was all polio. And so that was Martin and Lovett, and it was in response to this the inability, as far as Lovett was concerned, for the manual muscle tests to really be precise enough in order to track progression and regression and to identify what they needed to identify in terms of the weaknesses and the pattern of weaknesses that were happening in these cases of partial paralysis with these patients predominantly in Vermont. Now, here's the problem, right? This was in like Rutland, Vermont, where a lot of these cases sprung up. This is not exactly a major city. And so I had a conversation with a gentleman that's an orthopedic surgeon here, who was at one of the 2 He was trained at one of the two schools slash residencies, which was big treating polio patients a long time ago. There were two schools in Baltimore, and I was talking to him about this, and he said, you have to understand, because what I couldn't understand was if Lovett was such a huge proponent of the spring balance, he wrote a book in 1916 called The Treatment of Infantile Paralysis, and he talks about manual muscle testing in one chapter, and in another chapter, he talks about spring balance testing. There's a whole chapter dedicated to each one of these things. Now, he also says, when talking about manual muscle testing, he says, again, in the matter of treatment, some scale of measuring improvement or the reverse was urgently needed. Impressions that electricity of one kind or another, or rest, or exercise, are beneficial have filled the literature. Unsupported assertions, marvelous cures, and fantastic treatments have too often been advanced on the slenderest of grounds, with the realization that partial paralysis, which was the usual form of affection, basically led to all this kind of variable results, right? So people were thinking that their interventions were helping improve these people, and they had some crazy stuff that they were doing because the manual test was showing up better, which is why he was arguing for we need a quantitative way that's more objective, that we can measure these things. But when I asked this guy, why did the manual muscle testing stay then? Because we get forward to Kendall and Kendall in the 1930s, and they're using manual muscle testing. And so for a long time, I thought it was just the fact that it costs money, and we had the Great Depression. Was every clinic going to have, a spring balance and a table and all this other stuff? And what he said was, well, that might be part of it, but the bigger deal here was that a lot of these outbreaks were occurring outside of city centers. And what you needed the, believe it or not, the orthopedists or the physicians or the neurologists, they were teaching the mothers of the children with polio how to do the exercises. And they needed to teach these mothers a way to make sure that their exercises were actually having some benefit. And so that's why manual muscle testing stayed, even though Lovett was like, look, this is not a very reliable way. He's very clear it's not a reliable way to measure something. And but it had utility. And that's why it stuck.
That last section there, you were talking about the mothers and that they needed to teach the mothers a way to see that things were going the right direction. And I think you talked about muscle testing and exercise. So were these mothers of these kids, were they given some form of like resistance exercise, duplicated movement thing that the parents were doing with them to try and help them, but at the same time, some sort of assessment to see if it was working or progress?
Yeah, apparently the doctor would actually teach the doctor and or the physical therapist, because at this point, they had some physical therapists, as opposed to kind of assistants of orthopedists or gymnastics instructors, or which were more along the lines of personal trainers. And they would teach the mothers how to do what exercises to do and how to do the exercises, and then obviously the manual muscle tests. So yes, they were given kind of a range of exercises to do that were based off of the weaknesses that they were finding.
Now, on that note, and I think this is you just sprung to this thought, is that coming back, you were talking about that a lot of the testing they were doing was to try to identify different regions of muscles and groups based off of the nervous system and how it's connected to the brain to see how advanced the polio was. And so just like thinking back, I mean, to us, I think that seems like really straightforward knowledge of thinking of like a joint axis and skeletal muscle and which muscles are involved. I was just wondering, I mean, the mechanics of these tests, I mean, I know we're getting a little ahead and we're going to get to Kendall and Goodhart and stuff like that, but most of the stuff that I've seen nowadays, there are all sorts of range of motions where they're trying to connect them with individual muscles, and you're not only just checking an arm out in front, but there's external and internal rotations and stuff like that. these original tests that they were doing with duplicated movements and then transitioning to the exercise tests and manual muscle testing, how broad were these positions? Like, was it quite literally like just a shoulder flexion position? Like, and how were they choosing those, or were they thinking about anatomical muscles?
They were thinking about anatomical muscles, but if you go back to Wilhelmine Wright, and where's the here we go. So okay, Wright states this. This is 1907. It was my task to exercise the weakened muscles. In order to do that, I had to necessarily know, in the case of each muscle, what movements would bring about contraction. But who can tell me that? Gray, okay, as in the famous Henry Gray, the anatomist, Gray gave outward rotation of the thigh as an action of the adductor group. But when I asked the patient lying on his back on the table to rotate his thighs inward, the adductors contracted strongly. Which was Wright, Nature or Gray? So then Wright goes on to talk about how what she did was she had pulled a book off of her shelf. This is going to sound like the Goodhart story a little bit. And it was something by a guy named Charles Beevor, who gave a lecture. And Beevor basically used this type of method of identifying muscle function that he called the normal method, or I can't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But basically, up until that point, you had a couple different ways. There were three ways, or really two up until then. There were two ways of looking at muscle function to try to identify what a muscle does. The first was the anatomical way, where they literally would basically take a cadaver, they would attach strings to the tendons and the end of the tendons, and then they would go to the attachment site and tie it off there and then pull on it and see what the joint did. And that was the anatomical method. And then there was, I think some people call it the physiological method, but it was really Duchenne. And Duchenne was basically stimming stuff and seeing what happened. So he'd zap the crap out of a muscle and see what joint motion occurred when he zapped the crap out of a muscle. And I think his book was called Physiology of Action. And amazing work. I mean, just brilliance of Duchenne is just incredible. So you had those two styles, but you had Wilhelmine Wright basically going, okay, well, that's fine, but what about voluntary control over things? I mean, it's just because that's what they say. Now, Beaver said the same thing. So she pulls up. Beaver did it I think he did it for the lower extremity, and she did it for the upper extremity. So what Beaver did was basically watched and felt what muscles were contracting during certain movements. So have you ever seen physical therapists? When I was involved with MAT and I was teaching it, we would always get PTs in the class, and PTs would go and they would touch the muscle that they were testing. And I was always like, what are you doing? Like, why are you touching the muscle that you're testing? And we'd say, well, you don't want to do that because you could affect the outcome, whatever nonsense that was. But like, it was like, I never understood that. Well, this is a holdover from one of the ways they were trying to identify whether a muscle was actually doing something, right? If something was partially paralyzed, you might feel something completely different, right? Mm-hmm. Now, nobody I was ever working with was at that level. That's not totally true. I did have some people that had some paralysis, but in any case, rarely would it have ever been useful for me to do that. And I don't know that. I mean, sure, certainly physical therapy, I can understand perhaps the need to do that, but that idea is it's a holdover from Wright and Lovett's work, because it was this idea of like, well, how do you tell whether a muscle is actually doing something? Now, Wright was using it originally to identify what muscles to test, but it kind of carried over into Kendall and Kendall because they use it to like, well, here's another observational tool, right? If you go to test somebody's pec isn't a good example, but if you go test a male's pec and you're going to pull on it, right, and you're actually touching their pectoralis major, like, you're probably going to feel some sort of contraction underneath your hand, and that gives you extra feedback. Not necessarily that it's the most objective accurate way to do anything. In any case, I don't know whether that answers your question, but it goes back to the idea that all this stuff goes back to, yes, the duplicated movements, but it really becomes manual muscle testing with polio and the outbreaks of polio. I don't know whether that helps or not.
It does help a ton. And I know, and we can pull it up here. Actually, I'll pop it up really quickly. Anyone that's here, you're listening to this on Spotify and anywhere else, please check out the Fitness Pro Mentors group, because we're going to have a little link here. But Charlie, you mean you've done really an exceptional job of showcasing the history of this. And if anyone's watching this live, this section up at the top here, these kind of first 6 boxes or so, is really the polio stuff with the duplicated movements in manual muscle testing. So it's really interesting, because everything that you're kind of foreshadowing, you can see with right here where we get to Kendall and Kendall, it explodes into a gigantic tree of hands-on pushing on people. So, Charlie, do you want me to keep this up, or we can bounce back? What would you like to do?
You can if you'd like. I mean, that's fine.
Perfect.
So we're up to, we're really up to Kendall and Kendall. And there were people in between there, and I don't mean to, I shouldn't gloss over some of these important people like Lohman and others, but really the next kind of big blinking, flashing light is Florence and Henry Kendall, who were 2 physical therapists in Baltimore, Maryland. And I've spent a fair amount of time in the Kendall archives down at the University of Maryland, and pretty amazing people, both of them. And Kendall and Kendall effectively took Lovett and Wright's work, and they basically presented a scale that was more, I'm going to say precise. It's not the greatest word for this, but it was more fine. And they applied percentages to the scale. So now all of a sudden you had these percentages associated with those particular grades that we were talking about, those 6 grades that we were talking about before that it had kind of been modified. And that was their big thing. Now, I think that they had, I believe it was, let me 36. So their first book, they had this thing called the Public Health Bulletin, which was their first kind of published work on manual muscle testing. And then later on, they actually published their first work, which was Muscles Testing and Function. Now, for those of you familiar with this is the first work of theirs. Muscles Testing and Function was then put together with Posture and Pain. So if you have one of their newer things, it's going to say Muscles Testing and Function with Posture and Pain. But this is their original work, and it was published in 1949, and it had 36 manual muscle tests in it, and this percentage scale that they used for grading the manual muscle test. And it's kind of the seminal text. There is another one. So my history with manual muscle testing actually started before muscle activation techniques. It actually started with my first graduate program. And I was in an athletic training class, and we had Daniels and Worthingham's muscle testing. That was, I didn't spend a lot of time with it, but that was my first foray into that. That is the other seminal text here. And that one was supported by the U.S. government, as far as I can tell. So, and I think that was 1946, that the first edition of muscle testing techniques of manual examination, which was Daniels, Williams, and Worthingham. I don't think I have that on my timeline, but I believe it was 46 that was published. So these are really, and I gave away years ago my first edition of this to a girlfriend at the time, and so these are the I can't even. Here,
one second. There you go.
Holy smokes! Okay, there we go. Okay, so these are the 2 seminal works in manual muscle testing that many physical therapists, when they go to school, that's kind of what they're introduced to. And there was, at this time, there was actually a little bit of a controversy about whether whether manual muscle testing should be about testing muscles individually or testing motions. And the woman who kind of promoted the idea of testing motions, because she would argue that muscles are not represented in your brain individually like that, so we should be testing motions. And very logical way of addressing certain things. She published a paper in 1940, really talking about this, and it preceded, although it would actually followed Kendall and Kendall's public health bulletin. It preceded the other two manual muscle testing books. If we go forward, in the 1952, we get posture and pain. Now, I'm going to bring up posture and pain for one thing important. And posture and pain was Kendall and Boynton. So it's Kendall and Kendall again. This is 1952. This is 3 years after muscle testing and function. And they put in there the muscle tests, the manual muscle tests. And in this book, they're really talking about faulty posture, what they would consider postural deficits or defects. And they're trying to associate that there might be weakness, muscle weakness associated with these postural defects. And so there's something really important that I'm going to bring up later when we talk about Goodhart. This is what they say in Posture and Pain. The technique of manual muscle testing is basically the same in cases of faulty posture as in neuromuscular conditions, where the range of weakness, except the range of weakness encountered is less than a number of muscle tests that are of, except for the range of weakness encountered is less. Okay? So you're not going to find the weaknesses that you do in polio when you're testing these postural things with these manual muscle tests.
Charlie's audio frees up on us there, so I'm hoping he'll kick back in just a quick second here. But while I'm waiting for Charlie to come back, you guys can see Charlie's done an exceptional job of creating a timeline of this entire thing. And so what we're going to do, if you're listening to this, check out the Fitness Pro Mentors private Facebook group, because that Facebook group, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure this image is available for you. But really interesting stuff, this idea of duplicated movements and how it started off really as resistance exercise, like the most hands-on, most customized form where you're able to accommodate the profile of the exercise to the individual. I mean, absolutely fantastic. I know Peter, my late mentor, Peter Chason, was huge on manual learning how to use your hands, saying hands are your best set of tools. And so it's really quite an interesting segue to see this transition from your hands being a resistance exercise tool, and then how that exercise tool really has transitioned to potentially being a diagnostic tool. And so there you are, Charlie. Welcome back. I did a little spiel while you were on your little break there, going to the washroom, whatever.
What happened there,
No idea. But hey, you were in the middle of a description there if you want to jump back to that.
Okay, I don't know where I was. Did you hear me say that the term weak was not to be used for anything that was above the grade of fair for non-weight-bearing muscles?
No, let's go right over the whole thing.
Okay. All right, so here we go. All right, so what in Posture and Pain, what Kendall and Kendall Boynton said was that because muscle weakness, which grades less than 50%, is seldom encountered in cases of faulty posture, details about such grading are omitted, and it is suggested that evaluation of muscles with less than 50% strength be recorded as weak. It is only when the word weak is used formally as a test grade that it is used with this limited meaning. So the idea being that you don't call a muscle weak unless it's below the grade of fair. Now, fair with a non-weight-bearing muscle was you could hold your arm up relative to gravity. But if you put your hand on something and pushed on it, that was higher than a grade of fair. So manual resistance application in a manual muscle test could never have been called, the outcome should never have been called weak, according to the progenitors of at least of a lot of this style of testing.
Which is a massive jump to what we started to see once we bounce from Kendall to Goodhart.
Yes. All right, so we're going to Goodhart, are we? All right.
I feel like it looks
so
like
now,
it's the base of the tree, so we get this whole explosion here, so we got to get into the Goodhart.
All right, so, and I'm not going to go much beyond Goodhart, and the reason why is because there's no reason to. None of the things after Goodhart are quite honestly, worth talking a whole lot about, because they all manifested out of this massive, ridiculous experience that Goodhart had. So we're now at 1964, okay? And I hate to do this on a podcast, but I think it's important. I'm going to read out of the original Applied Kinesiology textbook. Now, let me explain what this was. Goodhart had this experience with a patient in 1964. That same year, he delivered a lecture. I think it's a conference, maybe the National Chiropractic Conference. It was in Denver, Colorado. Same year, 1964. And he had a manual with him that was called Applied Kinesiology. Now, for years, I tried to get my hands on this original manual. It required me actually going to a chiropractic college and into their library and pulling it off the shelf to actually get a chance to look at it for the first time. This is a book like the clinical kinesiology books that were not accessible to non-chiropractors. And so I'm going to read this because I don't know how many people have actually heard these words. But it is really, really, really important when it comes to this topic of manual muscle testing, because as you can see in this manual muscle testing tree, everything is an offshoot of Goodhart in some way. Even if there's some kind of referral back to Kendall and Kendall, there's still a hook back to Goodhart. Now, I will tell you that every one of these circles on this manual muscle testing tree that I have linked back to Goodhart, in their own material, they mention Goodhart somewhere. Okay? As the reason, as the progenitor, as the, whatever. So that's why they're all linking there. That's not me just guessing at that. They've all mentioned Goodhart as being kind of the originator. Okay? So I think we need to hear the originator story. It's not that long. It's very important, because there's about 4 different things that a critical analysis of what he's saying will make you go, what? Are you kidding me? All right, here you go. Some time ago, a young man presented himself for treatment, complaining of inability to use his left arm with any appreciable degree of forward thrust. If he would lean against a wall, the scapula would immediately protrude from the posterior thoracic chest wall. An analysis of this particular patient showed he had a completely inactive serratus anterior muscle. Method of testing for the serratus anterior loss of function was a standard method used by the United States Armed Medical Corps and other agencies whose job it is to rate and chart the amount of disability the particular patient has. Palpation in a bilateral fashion of both the right and left serratus revealed no apparent difference in muscle structure, tone, size, or quality, despite the fact that the patient remarked that he had this weakness: inability to use a forward pressure, such as attempting to push a car, or use any forward power of thrusting his arm for as long as he could remember. Upon palpating the origin of the serratus anterior on the affected side, I felt at the insertion of the serratus anterior on the root structure, on the rib structure, small, discrete, but palpable nodules, which were distinctly painful to moderate pressure and which did not present themselves on the other side. Attempting to discover if these areas might possibly be a trigger area, relatively heavy pressure was used in intermittent kneading fashion on the origin of the serratus anterior, with the results that it regained practically 70% of function in a matter of 2 to 3 minutes. This resumption of function maintained itself following treatment and did not require further treatment and follow-up. This particular patient has shown that his recovery has maintained itself for a period of almost 2 months. So there is the original story. So anybody that's ever rubbed on a muscle attachment now understands where origin insertion techniques comes from. And there's billions of different references back to this one experience of George Goodhart and him using this manual muscle test. Now, there's one other thing that I want to read you, because in 2005, they were honoring him, and he gave kind of like a keynote address at the annual Touch for Health conference. Touch for Health was one of these spin-offs John Thies spinoff of Goodheart. It was supposed to be kind of the lay version, the non-medical, non-chiropractic version of AK. And what he said was crazy, but what he said was, he's talking about this patient, and he says, having been embarrassed by the last time by his frequent inquiry, this patient was asking about his shoulder, I resurrected a book that had been given me by a colleague of mine, Dr. Raymond Cochet, a very fine chiropractor in Port Huron, Michigan, whom I had been able to help with a knee problem. And for Christmas, he had given me a copy of the book. I remembered that there was a muscle that pulled the shoulder blade forward so that it would lie flat on the chest wall. But something like the old adage, what you don't use, you lose. I knew the muscle existed, but I wasn't sure of its actual origin and insertion. When I applied myself to the book he had given me, Muscle Testing by Kendall and Kendall, I soon found the muscle that pulled the shoulder blade forward on the chest wall was the anterior serratus. There was a method for testing it which involved placing the patient's hand on a wall and then pressing on the spine in a forward direction, and the shoulder blade immediately stuck out. So here's the thing. That muscle test does not exist in that book. That muscle test is actually what's shown to identify a fully paralyzed muscle. And there's no pushing forward on the middle of the spine in muscle testing and function. What's important to understand about this is Goodheart had this patient, and there's 4 different stories about this that he himself tells. I mean, he can't get his own story straight. That's why I read the original AK story, because that was the closest one to the actual event that he's talking about. So this guy comes in, says that he can't get a job because he can't push forward, and he fails these physicals. Goodheart looks him over and does his postural analysis, sees his shoulder blade winging, and he says, oh, I wonder what that could be. Yeah, this guy gave me this book, Muscles Testing and Function. I bet the muscle that holds that to the thorax. So first of all, that a chiropractor doesn't know where the serratus anterior in 1964 is, that's a little bit disconcerting. But nonetheless, moving forward, he pulls the book off the shelf. He uses a manual muscle test that isn't really even in the book, and he claims that it's weak. There is no place in muscles testing and function where there is a grade of weak listed. So here you have a guy with no understanding of the context of muscles testing and function, and the fact that this all came out of polio, and it was predominantly used in conditions of paralysis. And because he wasn't using posture and pain, he pulls off the 1949 version, which did not have posture and pain in it, where, okay, the Kendalls extended it towards these faulty posture thing. And he then makes it binary, strong, weak. Now, here's a couple of problems. With this one experience, this whole AK thing is developed. And the original origin insertion technique comes from Goodheart testing the serratus anterior, feeling around. That's where the term palpation has gotten into this thing, y'all. He's feeling around and he feels nodules. He rubs on the nodules. They go away under his fingers. He goes back and he says there's a 70% increase in strength. If there's a 70% increase in strength, that means that it was only at about 30% before that. 30%, you couldn't have pushed on him at all. This whole thing is a mess. He completely miskontextualized Kendall and Kendall. He took it out of context. He didn't do the test the right way, right? And then he does this. He said he puts this grade of strong versus weak on it, which doesn't exist, except for in situations in that it comes up in posture and pain when you have a grade less than fair, or fair plus for weight-bearing muscles. Okay? So everything spins off of that. Everything, all these different techniques that you see on that web of, or that tree, that manual muscle testing tree, spins off of that single experience. So you asked me the question of, I'm still shocked when I read that. right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that this AK thing and all the different things that came off. Because what happened later on? When the rubbing on muscles didn't seem to work as well as it did that first time, well, now it became again about organ muscle relationships, and now it became about and different different scenarios that talked about neurolymphatic points and neurovascular points and the energy blockages and all the various things that people thought were the cause of the weakness. So interestingly, okay, when we talk about this whole kind of idea of what's happened here, if you ask me what kind of where I fell into this manual muscle testing thing, what started to happen was in about 2010, long before I knew any of this stuff. In 2010, I was trying to figure out the best way to palpate a muscle, to rub on a muscle. I was getting variable results in terms of I would go and test something, and then I would rub on it, and sometimes it would appear stronger to me, sometimes it wouldn't. So the first thing that I thought was, it must be my intervention. It must be the way that I'm actually rubbing this thing. So I started trying to mess around with every possible way that I could rub this thing. I rubbed it with more force. I rubbed it with less force. I rubbed it for longer periods. I rubbed it for less periods. Over and over and over again. There was a point in time where I was actually rubbing it in different lengths. So I was working with the Wizards at this particular point in time, and I had it in my head that if you rub the origin insertion, use origin insertion techniques, what we call palpation, on a muscle in the lengthened position, man, when I would go back to retest, it was super strong. I was like, look at this, I figured it all out. I got to rub on these muscles in a lengthened position, in a stretched position. Well, you can imagine, right? I'm at the Wizards facility working on a guy that's 6'9", 6'10", and I'm trying to, palpate his ischial tuberosity to get to one of his hamstrings, right? And I'm standing on the table holding his leg up, right? And I started to realize something, which was that when I was trying to palpate something, like on these NBA guys on this lengthened position, so to speak, it was taking me a long time, right? Because I had to lift their leg up in the air, I had to get up on the table, I had to rub this thing, and then, obviously, if you've ever felt anybody's hamstrings in a lengthened position at the ischial tuberosity, it's like a rock hard cord, and I'm like trying to well, I don't know whether I'm doing anything here, so I'm sitting there, right? So it's taken me forever to palpate this thing. And so I started thinking about it. I started going, wait a second. What if this has something to do with the time? What if this has nothing to do? What if it's the length of time of the palpation? What if it's not the length of the muscle? So I started rubbing things in that non-lengthened position, back to the way that I used to do it, but I started doing it for long periods of time. Minute plus, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Rubbing. Didn't see much difference than when I was doing it in the lengthened position. So then I was like, well, wait a second. What if this is nothing to do with the rubbing at all? What if this is the fact that when we do a manual muscle test, it's a motor event, it's an exercise, it could be eccentric, it could be isometric, depending upon whether you qualified it as strong or weak. What if I'm testing something and that's eliciting a response from them, and that's what's making this change? So then I started messing around with doing nothing in between manual muscle tests. And what I started to realize, and it's variable, was if I did a manual muscle test, then waited a very short amount of time, I rarely could measure a change. Generally across the board, if I waited more than 3 minutes, I could measure a change to the increase. And when I say measure, I'm not talking about with my hand. I'm talking about at this point, I'm using dynamometers hooked through a cable system so that I'm not touching the person, et cetera, et cetera. Not on the. So I started thinking, wait a second, I don't know what's going on here, but something about the test itself is actually eliciting a response from them. And I had remembered years earlier, Alex Rosenzweig, who's a friend of mine, had mentioned something about post-activation potentiation. And without going into a deep discussion, because that's your thing, that was one possible idea of why this manual muscle test might be unreliable, because it's actually changing the system. And it could be fatigue going one way. I mean, there's all these factors that we've talked about. It's getting to be close to the end time, so I do want to say one thing that really kind of always stuck in my head about training, which was, we talk oftentimes, and I used to teach this thing called specificity, right? We used to teach it in RTS, right? We used to bring up the Mel Siff super training. He would talk about the types of specificity, right? And we talk about specific adaptations that transfer and all this other stuff. I want somebody to I want a personal trainer to try to justify to me how rubbing a muscle, okay, is going to elicit a specific adaptation that transfers. Because it was something that plagued my brain forever, was that if you're looking at this as a stimulus, right? And if we go back to, we go back to my guy, Sargent, Dr. Sargent, right? And he's talking about progression, and he's talking about specificity. Specificity, okay. And where does he say it? There we go. All right, so if we look at the specific demands of a manual muscle test, right? Rate of force development, the force of the contraction time, the mode of the contraction, the position of the contraction, perhaps the muscle fiber type that you're getting into. Okay? If you're trying to address the specificity involved with this exercise we're calling the manual muscle test, how is the stimulus of rubbing on something going to address one of those things? If we're talking about specific adaptations that transfer, and we want our stimulus to basically elicit a response within one of the realms of these specific things, doesn't have to be all of them at the same time, does rubbing on a muscle somehow address the rate of force development? It can't. The force of contraction, the contraction time, the mode of contraction, the position of the contraction, the muscle fiber type. Now, unless you're going to try to argue that rubbing across the tendon somehow addresses some sort of reflexive, maybe position of contraction, but you better be doing it in the same position then, whatever. But the point is that we're way off the ranch if we think that origin insertion technique, is the reason why Goodhart experienced that change. He never considered for a second. The first thing that he thought of was, remember we talk about this post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? You do things in a certain order, and therefore you ascribe causality to something because of the order in which you did it in. I tested the muscle based on something I didn't understand because I pulled it off of a shelf and had no idea what I was doing. And then I was feeling around and I felt nodules. I rubbed on the nodules. They disappeared. I retested the muscle. It got 70% stronger. Therefore, it was because I rubbed on the nodules on the tendons that the muscle got stronger. Or anything that happened before that point. So, anyway, when we look back at Goodhart, he is responsible for the majority of these offshoots, and when we talk about we're not talking about the ability to help people. although we should be. We're talking about the long line of history that this comes from, and the specific context that this stuff was effectively generated in because of need. And that the context was really originally polio and chronic disease, if we want to go back to Ling.
Charlie, this was, I mean, by far, I think one of the most thorough listenings I've ever had of everything as it relates to the history of manual muscle testing. And I'm going to be sure to post the visual of this timeline. I want to say one thing. You brought up post-activation potentiation, and you said that's my thing. I have to disagree. I have developed some things to share the information, but that is 100% based off of your influence and push and everything you've shared with me, which I'm extremely honored for. I do want to close out today with kind of if you have a suggestion. I think this would be a great thing for anyone who's listening. There are so many, as we can see in this tree here, so many different applications of manual muscle testing that has been derived by Goodheart. It really has exploded in so many different types. And I'm wondering if someone has listened to this and they go, okay, there's something about this post-activation thing. There's some really interesting stuff around this history. And I think it's really fascinating that we went from, duplicated movements to suddenly testing because there was a requirement for, and then all of a sudden it turned into this gigantic thing that has both therapeutic and then trainers are applying it. It's really wild. But if someone is doing testing and they've kind of heard you and heard this research and they've done their research and they go, okay, great. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff here, but now what? Do you have any recommendations if someone's using manual muscle testing right now and they want to make a change and improve really what they're providing to their clients? Is there anything that comes to the front of your mind?
Yes. And here's what I'll say. I don't know the reason that I don't know that what the mechanism is that if you give enough time between manual muscle tests, oftentimes what you can see is an increase in force output measurably. I don't know what it is. I have a friend who's a researcher down in Brazil who showed that this happens on maximal tests, right, using dynamometry. And so he wrote a whole article about how this needs to be considered, because what we do when we do maximal voluntary isometric contractions in research oftentimes is we do 3 tests, and when we take the highest number out of all 3 of them. But the problem is that you've got this thing going on possibly called PAP, and if it is, then what all researchers, including me and the little bit that I did it with the study with GlaxoSmithKline, the 52 people that I tested on in that study, what you would see is the third one was always the highest, right? And it's always a joke for researchers. Like when you do maximal testing with maximal voluntary isometric contractions, the third one's always the highest. Well, could be to this PAP thing. So it should be accounted for as a possibility. Now you can leverage that. My suggestion is, and I developed something called the PEX with a little I scale on it, which is a way to work through isometric contractions to try to elicit the same response. So what I was saying, and what I was saying before I mentioned Dr. Gago, is that I don't know whether it's PAP. It could be operant conditioning, right? The person's been coming in long enough, they know, you've taught them it's going to be weak the first time you test it, it's going to be strong the second time you test it, whatever. It could be learning effect. Simply, maybe you've never seen them before, but now they know what you want out of them, right? It could be, you could have fatigue effect, could be excitability, presynaptically. It could be, lesser inhibition, presynaptic. You got a lot of different stuff that could be the reason. It might not be happening locally to the muscle in terms of like a PAP thing. I don't know. But what I will say is that if you take your manual muscle tests and whatever exercise, I'm a trainer, so all I care about is exercise with people. If you take an exercise that you plan on doing with somebody, and then you perform isometrics in the way that you might, in the positions that you might associate the manual muscle tests to exercises. For instance, if your pec test is somewhere along the lines of being around here, and you're about to do a chest press, and you have somebody do isometrics, maybe graded isometrics, maybe there's different versions that I show with the Pexi scale. Maybe you ramp from no force to 100% effort. Maybe you do pulses, which I call, that are increasing in terms of their amount of force, or maybe you do some version of stepwise contractions up to their max. Whatever it is, you can prepare them for the exercise that they're about to do by generating that acute response. Because what I can say is PAP it's an acute response. And if you want to turn it into something more of an adaptation, you're going to have to train it. Anybody who used to watch anybody who attended my Jumpstart classes, that's what we spent all of Sunday doing. Okay, it's fine here to try to get this thing so it appears to be stronger. Let's go train it, because that's the whole point. Let's go use, perhaps if we got something out of it, what we got. Is that good enough?
Absolutely. Anyone who's listening to this, I mean, honestly, comment below. What do you want more from Charlie? But honestly, I mean, dude, this was incredible. Really, I think this was perfect.
We can do the Pexi scale too. I can put it up on my Facebook page, and anybody, if you watch my Facebook, you'll see those versions of that and the EMG of it too. So
brilliant. Well, whoever's listening to this, whenever you're listening to this, if you want to check out the PEC scale, you want to see the manual muscle testing chart, if you're listening to this in audio form, please send me, join the Fitness Pro Mentors Facebook group, and ask me a question. If you know Charlie, ask him, because, I mean, there's one thing about you that I admire more than anything, Charlie, and it's really your openness to share and give information to people so they can make their own conclusions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, part of the reason for that is because we think we came up with this stuff. We think our generation is so smart, and you realize these guys in the early 1800s, I mean, give me a break.
Charlie, thank you so much for this. I think this was fantastic. How do you feel about this?
I hope it's valuable in some way.
Well, anyone who's listening to this right now, please let Charlie know how valuable this is. But Charlie, thank you so much. This was brilliant. I really appreciate it, and look forward to giving this to you so you can share it with wherever you want to put it.
I appreciate that.
Awesome, Charlie. Thank you for everything, man. We'll talk to you real soon.
All right, sounds good. Cheers.